Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text.
Usually when you're preparing for a routine pelvic exam, there's this baseline expectation of what you're actually going to see. You're anticipating smooth, uniform, pink tissue.
Yeah, you're looking for a very standard, predictable anatomical landscape, essentially.
Right. It's supposed to be visually clean, but then, you insert the speculum, and right there, just peeking out of the cervical os, is this bright red, soft, kind of finger-like growth, and suddenly that predictable landscape is totally disrupted.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the absolute definition of a clinical surprise.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking at cervical polyps, why these highly vascular clinical surprises appear in your patients, and why removing them requires a surprisingly low-tech twist.
Literally a twist.
Literally. So if you're a nursing or advanced practice student gearing up for clinicals or studying for exams, this is for you. We are mastering Chapter 51 of Advanced Health Assessment of Women, focusing strictly on cervical polypectomy.
And we're going to do this sequentially right through the chapter, moving from the pathophysiology and patient profile into the history and exam, and then straight through to clinical interpretation and in-office management.
Yeah, exactly. Connecting the dots so it actually sticks. So before we can assess or treat a patient, we really need to know what we're looking for, and maybe more importantly, who is most likely to be sitting on the exam table.
Right, because demographics are your absolute best context clue here. So cervical polyps are actually the most common benign tumors of the cervix, but they definitely favor a specific profile. We usually see them in menstruating, paris women, meaning women who have previously given birth.
Okay.
And typically this happens in their fifth decade of life, so primarily women in their 40s.
Which tells me that, if a young non-menstruating patient comes into the clinic and I see something unusual, a cervical polyp probably wouldn't be at the top of my differential diagnosis.
No, it would be highly unusual. I mean, they are extremely rare in young, non-menstruating women. So age and reproductive history, those are the absolute foundation of your assessment right out of the gate.
Got it. So let's talk about the visual, because understanding the physical structure of this thing, like looking at figure 51.1 in the text, is crucial for knowing how to deal with it clinically.
Exactly.
We described it as a red finger-like growth, but the key medical term the chapter uses here is pedunculated.
Yeah, pedunculated. It's a great descriptive word. When a lesion is pedunculated, it means it grows on a little stalk that projects out from the surface of the cervical canal.
So it's not just a flat bump.
Right, exactly. If you visualize a cross-section of the cervix, like in that figure, you'd see this very narrow stalk anchoring the polyp to the inner canal, while the main, wider body of the polyp just kind of hangs down freely.
It makes me think of like a tiny vascular balloon on a string, or almost like a small hanging grape right there at the opening of the cervix.
That's a perfect analogy. And size-wise, I mean, they could be tiny, just a few millimeters, or up to just under 3 centimeters in length.
Oh, wow. Up to 3 centimeters.
Yeah. And the reason they look like that is because they're essentially an overgrowth of one of the cervical folds. And because of how they grow outward, relying entirely on that one narrow stalk for their blood supply, they are incredibly friable.
Right, friable. That's one of those clinical words that basically just means treat with extreme care because it will bleed if you look at it wrong.
Exactly. They tear so easily. They contain a massive number of fragile blood vessels right near the surface. And usually, a patient only has one of these little blends, though, occasionally there might be two.
Which brings up probably the most critical clinical rule regarding their management.
Oh, the golden rule. Yes.
Right. And I'm glad we're tackling this rule because I look at this situation, a very common, almost universally benign growth, and part of me thinks, why make such a big deal out of removing them?
It's a fair question.
If they're almost always benign and they usually don't grow back once removed, why do we need to treat the removal like, high stakes evidence collection? Why not just toss it in the biohazard bin and send the patient home with good news?
Well, because almost always isn't always. The golden rule of advanced practice here is that absolutely all removed tissue must be sent to the pathology lab for microscopic evaluation. There are no exceptions to this.
Wait, even if it looks completely standard and benign to the naked eye?
Especially then. I mean, there is a 0.2 to 0.4% incidence rate of abnormal precancerous or, frankly, malignant cells hiding inside what looks like a totally benign polyp.
Wow, okay.
Yeah. And furthermore, while that specific polyp you just removed won't grow back, women who develop a polyp once are at a higher risk of growing entirely new ones in the future. So having a clear pathology baseline is just vital for their ongoing care.
So we know every single one of these is heading to the pathology lab. That makes me wonder what the lab is actually seeing under the microscope. Like, what is happening at the cellular level that turns a normal cervical fold into this friable red balloon?
Right. So bridging into the pathophysiology, when the lab looks at the specimen, they're going to see a core of loose vascular connective tissue. And this core is covered by endocervical epithelium.
Okay.
But the really revealing part is the stroma, the underlying supportive tissue.
Basically the internal scaffolding of the polyp.
Precisely. That scaffolding often appears inflamed and edematous, meaning it's swollen with fluid. This microscopic makeup, the loose tissue, the highly concentrated blood vessels, the fluid swelling, that is exactly why they look so soft, fragile, and bright red to us in the clinic.
And where are they usually anchoring themselves? We know they peek out of the halses, but where does the stalk actually start?
They usually originate in the lower endocervix. And because they grow downward, they just protrude right through the cervical os. But, you can also find them at the squamocolumnar junction or on the portio vaginalis, which is the part of the cervix that physically projects down into the vaginal canal.
This gets to the real mystery, though. I mean, why do they form in the first place? We know it's an overgrowth of tissue, but what's the underlying physiological trigger?
Well, the exact etiology isn't completely understood, which, is a fairly common theme in women's health.
Unfortunately.
But there are 3 primary culprits driving their creation according to the text. The first is an abnormal localized response to increased levels of estrogen. The second is chronic inflammation. And the third is localized congestion, essentially, clogged blood vessels in the cervix.
Okay, wait, I need to push back on that first point for a second.
Sure.
If these polyps are linked to an abnormal response to increased estrogen, and they predominantly form in menstruating women in their 40s, why does the text mention abnormal vaginal bleeding after menopause as a classic symptom?
It's a great catch.
Because estrogen drops dramatically after menopause. That feels like a massive physiological contradiction.
It definitely seems like one on the surface, but if you look at the timeline of the tissue, it clears it up completely. The polyps typically form during a woman's reproductive years when estrogen levels are high and fluctuating. So they're born out of that estrogen-rich environment.
Right.
But remember their structure. They are packed with blood vessels, and the stroma is highly inflamed and edematous.
So they're basically little vascular landmines just waiting to be set off.
Exactly.
Huh.
A woman might develop the polyp in her 40s, but it just sits there silently. It's completely asymptomatic. But years later, after menopause, the surrounding vaginal and cervical tissues undergo atrophy. They lose their elasticity, and they become much thinner, drier, and more delicate.
Ah, I see. So the structural fragility of the polyp, combined with that thinner postmenopausal tissue, means any disturbance is going to cause a bleed.
Yes. The polyp itself didn't need high estrogen to bleed. It just needed high estrogen to form initially. Once the surrounding tissue loses its protective thickness post-menopause, that friable polyp is incredibly exposed to friction.
That completely reframes how we should think about patient history. Because, these polyps are so fragile and packed with blood vessels, it makes total sense that a patient's main complaint wouldn't be pain, it would be unexplained spotting.
Right. And honestly, in many cases, there isn't even a complaint. Most of the time, polyps are completely asymptomatic. The patient had absolutely no idea it was there until you open the speculum for a routine exam.
But when symptoms do surface, it's all about abnormal bleeding.
Yeah. A patient's history might reveal menorrhagia, which is abnormally heavy periods, but more commonly, it's contact bleeding. Because the polyp is so fragile, physical contact is the primary trigger.
Like what kind of contact?
This typically presents as abnormal vaginal bleeding after douching or postcoital bleeding, which is bleeding after intercourse.
I like to picture a friable polyp as like a scraped knee that hasn't quite healed over yet.
Yeah.
You have that fresh, highly vascular tissue right at the surface. And if you leave it entirely alone, it won't bleed.
Right. It's fine if untouched.
But any friction, whether from intercourse or the physical trauma of douching, is going to immediately scrape away that delicate surface and cause spotting.
It's a very mechanical cause and effect. They can also cause intermenstrual bleeding, spotting between regular periods. But knowing that the primary symptom is mechanical bleeding brings up a really fascinating clinical decision pathway: to remove or not to remove.
Wait, really? Because if I'm looking at a completely asymptomatic patient who has no heavy bleeding, no spotting after intercourse, and we just happen to see this tiny polyp during a routine exam, do I actually have to put them through a removal procedure?
Strictly speaking from the text, no. If the polyp is not bothersome, isn't causing heavy bleeding, and is entirely asymptomatic, it actually does not require removal.
I feel like that goes entirely against the instinct to fix everything we find during an exam.
It does. And clinically, a lot of providers do opt to remove them anyway, simply because it's such a straightforward, quick procedure to perform right then and there. But medically, if it isn't a problem for the patient, you aren't forced to intervene.
Okay, but let's say we do intervene. The patient is symptomatic, or you both agree to just get it out of there. We're looking at this pedunculated vascular growth. How do we physically get it out without creating a massive bleeding issue? I'm guessing we can't just go in with scissors and snip it.
You really can't, and the mechanics of the standard procedure are fascinating for exactly that reason. There are two distinct techniques based on the size of the polyp.
Okay, let's start with the small ones.
For a standard small polyp, you first have to determine the site of origin. You need to clearly see exactly where that stalk attaches to the cervix.
Right, make sure you aren't grabbing blind.
Exactly. Then you grasp the polyp with a clamp. But here's the surprising part. You don't cut. You twist. You twist the clamp continuously till the polyp separates from the stalk.
Wait, twisting it off? That sounds almost medieval. Why on earth are we twisting it instead of making a clean surgical cut?
It comes down to the physics of those blood vessels we talked about earlier. If you take scissors and cleanly snip a highly vascular stalk, those vessels are left wide open like cutting a pressurized garden hose, and it causes significantly more bleeding.
Oh, I see.
When you twist the stalk, the torsion forces the blood vessels to tightly constrict and seal themselves as the tissue separates.
So the twisting motion is actually creating built-in hemostasis. You're pinching the hose shut as you remove the nozzle.
Exactly. It controls the bleeding at a structural level before you even apply any chemical agents. And then once it's separated, you apply silver nitrate or Monsul solution to the base to ensure complete hemostasis.
That is brilliant physiological engineering. Torsion equals vessel constriction. But what about larger polyps? You mentioned two techniques. If a polyp is bigger, say, over 5 millimeters, twisting seems like it could cause way too much collateral damage.
It would. The stalk of a polyp larger than 5 millimeters is simply too thick. Twisting it could cause uncontrolled bleeding, or you might actually tear the underlying cervical tissue. So for the larger ones, you have to use technique 2. You ligate the blood supply first.
Meaning we tie it off?
Yes. You still determine the origin, but instead of grabbing the body of the polyp, you clamp about 0.5 centimeter above the origin of the pedicle.
So you deliberately leave a tiny bit of the stalk below the clamp.
Right. Leaving that stalk gives you the physical room to tie a surgical ligature between the clamp and the cervix. You are literally tying a knot around the blood supply. Once that is secure, you remove the clamp.
And now it's safe to use scissors.
Now it is safe. You take scissors with a fine blade and cut along the suture line to remove the polyp. The tied ligature stays behind, keeping those large vessels clamped shut.
Wow.
Or, alternatively, you can actually just tie the ligature and stop right there.
Wait, leave the polyp attached in the patient?
Yeah. If you leave it tied off, the polyp undergoes infarction, meaning its blood supply is completely choked off and the tissue will eventually die and naturally slough off on its own.
That is incredible. But whether we twist it, snip it, or let it slough off, we are putting that tissue in a jar and sending it to pathology.
Always. I cannot overstate the safety precaution there. Malignancy can and does occur in these benign-appearing structures. The visual assessment is never the final diagnosis.
Okay, so the physical procedure is done, the polyp is off, hemostasis is achieved, and the specimen is heading to the lab. But part of being a great clinician is knowing your boundaries, managing complications, and educating your patient. So when do we look at a polyp and say, I shouldn't do this in the office?
Knowing when to refer is a hallmark of safe practice. If that polyp is larger than 5 millimeters and you, as the provider, are not comfortable or equipped to do the surgical ligature method we just discussed, you need to refer the patient out.
And what kind of procedure are we referring them for at that point?
They would typically be referred for a loop electrosurgical excision procedure. That uses an electrical current to cut the tissue while simultaneously cauterizing it. Or they might be referred for laser therapy. Both are excellent options for safely managing larger, thicker stalks because the thermal energy seals the vessels.
What if the polyp isn't actually on the cervix, though? Like, what if we see a stalk coming down, but the base is way up inside the uterus?
Oh, that completely changes the management plan. If you suspect an endometrial polyp higher up in the uterus, you do not attempt to twist or ligate it in the office.
Too risky.
Way too risky. That patient requires a dilation and curettage, a DNC, or a hysteroscopy. Those procedures allow a provider to safely visualize and access the inside of the uterus to surgically cut or scrape the growth off.
So cervical polyps are often in-office procedures. Endometrial polyps require a higher level of intervention.
Exactly.
Let's talk about the patient who just had a standard cervical polypectomy in your office. They're getting dressed. What are we telling them to expect over the next few days?
Patient education here is all about managing expectations. You must warn them that they might experience slight cramping and some light bleeding or spotting for a few days post-removal. If you don't tell them this, they're going to panic when they see blood, thinking something went terribly wrong.
And we also need to remind them why we sent the tissue off, right? Just to close the loop on the clinical implications.
It's a delicate balance. You're reassuring them that these are overwhelmingly benign, while explaining that rarely actual cervical cancers can first present as a simple polyp. Similarly, certain uterine polyps are associated with uterine cancer. The pathology report is the definitive answer, and you'll follow up when you have it.
Assuming that pathology report comes back clear, which it usually does, what does their long-term follow-up look like? Are we scheduling them for frequent checks to make sure another one hasn't popped up?
The great news for the patient is that no special follow-up is required. Once these specific polyps are properly removed, they seldom recur in that exact same spot. The patient simply returns to their standard, routine gynecological care schedule.
Well, that is a massive relief for the patient. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you head into your clinicals. Consider how the cervix acts as a highly reactive physical barometer for the whole body.
Yeah, it's far from just static, unchanging tissue.
Right. It responds to these invisible systemic forces like localized surges in hormonal estrogen or chronic cellular inflammation by physically manifesting these vascular finger-like growths. It's a perfect, tangible example of how a patient's internal chemical environment literally shapes their physical anatomy.
It is a profound perspective. When you remove a polyp, you're looking at the historical record of the body's physical response to hormones and inflammation.
Keep that connection in mind next time you open a speculum and find a clinical surprise waiting for now. A warm thank you from the Last Minute Lecture team for joining us on this deep dive. Good luck on your exams, and we will catch you on the next one.